The snow was still, endless, stretching in all directions. There was only the wind. The gusts howled over the frozen landscape, but they did nothing to ease the cold in Sarah's bones. She lay in the snow, her body half buried, her limbs stiff with cold. Her breath was shallow, each exhale a thin trail of vapor lost in the frigid air. Her fingers were frozen, the skin a deep, painful blue, and her cheeks were streaked with the remnants of tears that had frozen before they could fall completely. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was tight, dry, barely able to take in a breath. The snow beneath her felt like a tomb, cold and unforgiving. Her father's tracks led away from her deep prints in the white expanse, disappearing into the horizon. He had left her here. He had walked away, and she didn't know why. But she knew it didn't matter now. The cold was taking her. Her thoughts drifted, hazy. She didn't know how long she'd been here, how long she had been drifting between unconsciousness and half-awareness. But then the sound of hooves broke through the howl of the wind. Heavy, rhythmic. The sound was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. And then she saw him, a figure, dark against the brightness of the snow, a man on horseback. He was a rancher. That much was clear. The horse slowed to a stop, and the man dismounted quickly, his boots crunching against the snow. He bent over her, his rough hands coming to rest on her shoulders, pulling her into his arms. She didn't fight him. She couldn't. Her body was too numb. Her head lolled against his chest, and the sound of his heartbeat was the only thing that anchored her to the world. He didn't say anything. He just lifted her, cradling her against him as if she were a fragile thing. He didn't ask why she was out here. Didn't ask who she was, where she came from, or what had happened. There was no question in his eyes, only a silent understanding that this was a thing that had to be done. He pulled her onto his horse, settling her in front of him, and urged the animal forward. The wind whipped around them, but the warmth of his body kept her from slipping into unconsciousness. There was no immediate explanation, no words. Only a quiet urgency in the way he moved, as if he had done this before. And perhaps, in a way, he had. The rancher didn't look back at the snow-covered land they left behind. He only stared ahead, his jaw set, eyes narrowing against the wind. His name was Paul, but Sarah didn't know that yet. She wouldn't ask. They rode for what felt like hours. When they arrived at his cabin, it was little more than a shadow against the endless white, a dark silhouette in the middle of the barren field. The house was small, its wood darkened by years of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of the snow that had gathered there. A few scattered cattle milled around the area, their low moans carried on the wind. Paul dismounted and lifted Sarah off the horse, cradling her once more in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to take in the sight of the place, simple, remote, and cold, like everything else. It was a place for hard men and even harder lives. A place that kept secrets and never let them go. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. Paul set her down on the worn couch by the hearth, the fire crackling low. He didn't speak, only worked in silence, gathering blankets, pillows, and dry clothes from nearby drawers. He wrapped her in the thick wool, then poured a cup of water from a tin pot and set it beside her. She didn't take the water. She didn't move much at all, save for the occasional flutter of her lashes, the faintest sound of a breath escaping her lips. Paul stood back, watching her. He didn't know why he'd brought her here. He wasn't a man for company, especially not for broken things. But there was something in her that unsettled him, something that made him feel as though he were meant to do this, even if it didn't make any sense. He glanced at the door, then back to the girl, but he didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. She stared at him for a moment, her eyes filled with quiet wariness. "You gonna ask where I came from?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Paul shook his head. "Don't matter." She seemed to weigh his words, then let the silence settle between them. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt comfortable, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. Just heavy, like the weight of something unspoken hung in the air. Finally, Sarah shifted slightly, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the wool. "I'm Sarah," she said, almost to herself. He left me." Paul didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say to that either. The fire crackled in the background, but it did little to ease the cold that seemed to stretch between them. In the dim light of the cabin, he stood by the window, looking out into the night. The snow still fell, thick and fast, but in the distance, the silhouette of the mountains loomed, quiet and unchanging. The wind had slowed, but the world outside remained frozen. Sarah closed her eyes, drifting in and out of sleep, her mind replaying fragments of her father's face, his voice. She hadn't seen him clearly in days. Or was it weeks? She couldn't remember. She only remembered the way he had walked away, leaving her behind without a word. And then there was Paul. A stranger. Yet, somehow, she wasn't afraid. She didn't know why. Maybe because, in the silence of this small cabin, with its creaking wood and dimming fire, she could feel something, some strange, unspoken connection. Whatever it was, she had no choice but to trust him. For now. Paul didn't ask questions. He simply let Sarah rest, never pressing her for details she wasn't ready to give. She didn't ask for help either, but she didn't fight him when he wrapped her in blankets, when he set her by the fire, when he placed a bowl of soup in front of her. Her fingers shook as she held the spoon, but the warmth of the food spread through her, dulling the cold that had settled deep in her bones. He watched her, but didn't speak. Her silence was a thing he understood, a silence born from too much pain, too much loss. He didn't need her to say anything. He knew what silence could mean. After a while, she put the spoon down, staring into the fire, her gaze distant. The flames cast shadows across her face, making her look even younger, like a child who had been forced to grow up too fast. He had seen that look before, though he never spoke about it. People who came to this land didn't talk much. They didn't need to. "You'll stay here tonight," Paul said, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. Sarah didn't reply. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Just stared into the fire. He wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he knew it wasn't anything good. Her father had left her to die, and she had been alone for however long before he'd found her. He didn't ask where she'd come from. He didn't care. But he knew the land had a way of taking what it wanted, and sometimes it didn't give back. He didn't know why Sarah was here or why she had been abandoned, but he didn't need to know. She was here now. He stood up and walked to the door. There was work to be done, cattle to tend to. But as he reached for the latch, he stopped. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, his tone not quite a question, more of a statement. Sarah didn't acknowledge him. She just sat there, lost in the fire. Paul left anyway, not bothering to look back. The morning light filtered through the small cabin window, soft and gray. Sarah woke to the sound of the door creaking open, a gust of cold air slipping in from the outside. Paul stepped in, carrying a bundle of wood. He set it down near the stove before glancing at her. "You're awake," he said, his voice gruff. Sarah didn't respond. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Her head was pounding, the remnants of the cold still lingering in her skin. But she didn't feel like talking, didn't feel like explaining why she was here or how she'd ended up in the snow. Not to him. Not to anyone. "I'll take you outside later," Paul added, not waiting for her to ask. "Show you the land." Sarah didn't care. She had no interest in the land. She had no interest in anything but the memory of her father's face, his disappearing footsteps in the snow, the way he had left her. But something in Paul's voice made her look up. He wasn't offering pity. He wasn't offering much of anything, really, except for a place to stay. But there was something else in his silence. A quiet understanding. Something she couldn't name but recognized all the same. She nodded, not because she wanted to go outside, but because she didn't have the strength to argue. He didn't push. Paul didn't talk much. He just moved around the cabin, setting up the fire and the stove, preparing for the day. There was no small talk, no words meant to comfort. He wasn't trying to be kind, he just was. Eventually, Sarah stood, her body stiff from the cold. Her legs were weak, but she forced herself to move. You'll stay here as long as you need, Paul said, as though reading her thoughts. He met her eyes for the first time since she'd woken up, his gaze steady but unreadable. Sarah wanted to say something, to tell him she wasn't staying, that she didn't need his pity. But she didn't. The words got stuck somewhere deep in her throat. Instead, she just nodded again. There was no warmth in the cabin. The fire sputtered low, barely enough to fill the air with heat. Paul didn't seem to mind. He never had. Hours passed, and Sarah found herself sitting by the window, watching the snow fall. The silence between her and Paul stretched long. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable, just inevitable. There was no need for words. The land was quiet, the wind carrying nothing but emptiness. Paul came and went, checking the cattle, fixing the fences, never speaking much. Every time he returned, he would look at Sarah, but say nothing. She didn't mind. The wind picked up, swirling around the cabin in sharp gusts. Paul walked in again, his face drawn, his movements tired. "You'll need to come with me," he said. "The cattle are in a bad way. I can't manage them alone." Sarah didn't want to go, didn't want to leave the warmth of the cabin, but she stood anyway. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but she didn't look at him. There was a part of her that wanted to break, to let the grief take over, but she didn't. Not in front of him. Not yet. She pulled on her coat, gloves, and boots, and followed him out into the cold. The world outside was wide, barren, the land stretching in all directions. Snow crunched beneath her boots as they walked toward the barn, Paul's silhouette ahead of her. She was no longer in a hurry to escape him, but she wasn't ready to talk either. She wasn't ready to tell him what had happened. She wasn't ready to ask the questions that burned in her mind. Why had he left her? Why had her father abandoned her? The questions were sharp, jagged things that would cut her open if she let them. But she didn't let them. Not yet. Paul didn't ask anything either. He just worked, his rough hands moving swiftly over the animals, the barn, the tools. He didn't need to talk, didn't need to explain anything. He was used to silence. The silence was his company, and it had always been enough. But Sarah felt it, felt the space between them, thick and heavy. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she wasn't leaving this place anytime soon. She wasn't ready for answers, but she wasn't ready to run either. Not yet. And so they worked, side by side, in the bitter cold, neither speaking, neither trusting. Just existing together in the quiet, knowing that something would have to give. Paul didn't ask her name. Didn't ask where she came from. He just gave her a room in the back of the cabin, tucked in a corner where the fire couldn't quite reach. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't know how to argue. She just sat, the wool blankets wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring into the fire as it danced and cracked. Her stomach growled. But she didn't ask for food. She didn't want to eat. Paul didn't seem bothered by the silence. He was used to it. He moved about the cabin, doing things. Setting logs on the fire. Stoking the stove. Staring out the window at the cattle grazing outside. Every now and then, he'd glance at her, but he never said anything. His boots would creak against the floor, the crack of firewood the only sound. After a while, he brought her something to eat. A bowl of thick stew. He set it down on the table, silent, before taking a seat across from her, not waiting for her to reach for it. She didn't. Not right away. "You'll need to eat," he said, the words heavy but not unkind. "Don't matter if you're not hungry." She didn't answer. She just watched the steam rise from the bowl. It smelled good. Comforting. But her stomach twisted, and she felt sick at the thought of it. "Don't look at it like that," Paul said. "You'll get stronger." Her hands shook as she wrapped her fingers around the bowl. The warmth seeped through her, but it was nothing compared to the cold that had taken root deep inside her. She lifted the spoon to her mouth, but stopped before it touched her lips. She stared at the reflection in the soup, her face pale, cracked with the remnants of tears. Paul didn't push. He just sat there, watching her. His face was a mask, unreadable. There was a hardness to him, an edge that Sarah didn't know how to approach. Finally, she took a bite, the stew sliding down her throat like gravel. She swallowed quickly and set the spoon back down. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't sure she ever would be again. Paul shifted in his chair. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping against the wood, a quiet rhythm he didn't seem to realize he was making. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough. "Until you get back on your feet." She nodded, barely. It wasn't a promise she wanted, but it was one she didn't know how to refuse. The night passed slowly. Sarah lay in the small bed, blankets pulled up to her chin, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the wind howling outside rattled the walls, but inside, there was only silence. She couldn't sleep. She didn't know if she wanted to. Her thoughts kept drifting to her father, his face, the way he had walked away from her, his back turned, disappearing into the snow. She could still see it. The tracks in the snow, deep and clear, leading away from her. It was all she had left. She wanted to scream. Wanted to rage against it. But there was nothing left. No tears, no anger, just a hollow space inside her that felt like it would never be filled. The door creaked open. "Sarah?" Paul's voice was low, tentative, like he wasn't sure if she was awake or not. She didn't respond. He stepped in anyway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. "I've got work to do tomorrow. You'll be staying here again. You can stay in the cabin or I can show you around the land. Your choice." Sarah didn't care about the land. Didn't care about anything. But she didn't want to be alone in this room either. She didn't trust the silence. "Show me," she said, her voice hoarse. Paul nodded. "You'll be in good hands. It's just land. Nothing else. Nothing else." It wasn't just the land. It was the weight of the world pressing in on her chest. The weight of what her father had left behind. He left her. Just like that. Paul lingered at the door for a moment longer. Then, he turned and left, closing it gently behind him. The next morning, Paul led her outside. The cold hit her like a slap, the wind biting at her skin. But she didn't flinch. She had learned how to endure pain, how to ignore it, even if it burned her inside. The land stretched out in every direction, snow blanketing the earth, the sky a dull gray above them. It was vast and empty, a place where nothing seemed to grow, where nothing seemed to matter. A place that swallowed things whole. Paul led her past the barn, the cattle grazing in the distance, their heads low against the wind. He walked with purpose, boots crunching in the snow, his pace steady and unwavering. "This is where you'll stay for as long as you need," Paul said, his voice flat. "The land's quiet here. Not much to it." Sarah didn't answer. She didn't care. The land didn't matter. Her father's face was all that mattered, the way he had left her, and the cruel silence that followed. The land could swallow her whole for all she cared. They came to the well. It stood in the middle of the field, an old stone structure with a rusted iron bucket hanging from a frayed rope. It was out of place, a forgotten thing in the middle of nowhere. Paul stopped, looking down into the well. "Old," he said. "Been here for longer than I can remember. Don't use it anymore." Sarah looked at it, her gaze drawn to the dark hole. Something about it unsettled her. There was something in the way the shadows pooled at the bottom, something that made her stomach twist. "I don't like it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowing, before he turned and walked away. Sarah stayed where she was, staring at the well, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for her. Waiting for something to fall in. Sarah woke to a sound, soft, almost inaudible. Her breath caught, her heart racing. The fire in the hearth had long since died down to embers, the cabin chilling with the early morning air. She pulled herself up, feeling the weight of the cold against her skin. The house was silent, except for the quiet crackle of the fading fire. Then she heard it again. A faint whispering, distant, as though the wind had a voice. She shook her head. It was nothing. The cold had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Still, her heart beat faster, thudding against her ribs. She could hear her father's voice, faint but clear. She knew that voice. It was the same one she had heard the day he left. Cold, detached, like it didn't matter at all. She shivered and climbed out of bed, the floorboards creaking beneath her. The cabin was dark and still. Paul had already gone out to tend to the cattle. She hadn't seen him leave, but she knew he was gone. He always left early, always worked in the mornings, never asking if she was ready. It had been 3 days since she had been brought here. 3 days of silence. 3 days of nothing but the bitter cold and the sound of the wind. And in those days, the nightmares had begun. They weren't just dreams, they felt like memories, visions of her father's face, his back turned as he walked away from her in the snow. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It was always the same, the snow, the silence, the emptiness. Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the endless white. The land stretched before her, vast and quiet, the wind sweeping over it like an old ghost. It felt like it was watching her, waiting for something. She turned away from the window, her fingers trembling. Paul returned that afternoon, his face hardened by the cold. He didn't speak when he entered. He just hung his coat by the door and went straight to the stove to stoke the fire. The warmth from the flames reached her quickly, but it wasn't enough to chase away the chill in her bones. She didn't move from where she sat at the table, her eyes glued to the flickering light. "You've been quiet," Paul said, his voice low as he poured a cup of coffee. Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure she wanted to talk. Paul set the cup down in front of her. "You need to eat. Get your strength up." She didn't look at him. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the swirling patterns in the fire. It was all she could focus on, its flickering, its movement. It made her feel something. A dull, desperate ache. It reminded her of the warmth that had once been in her father's eyes. Before the coldness had taken over. Paul sat across from her, his boots heavy on the floor. His fingers wrapped around his own cup, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she didn't look up. "You're not eating," he said. "That won't help you." "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. She hated how weak it sounded. "Bullshit," Paul muttered. He leaned forward, his voice more insistent. "You can't stay like this." She looked up then, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. There was something there, something that she didn't understand. Not pity, not concern. Just something deep and raw. "I'm not going to get better," she said. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth she hadn't wanted to admit to herself. "Not really. It doesn't matter." Paul's eyes flickered. "It matters. You can't just stay here in this cabin and die. I'm not letting you." Sarah felt the coldness inside her flare up at his words. His determination, his insistence, felt like something she couldn't escape. She wanted to scream at him, tell him to leave her alone. But instead, she just laughed. "Let me? You don't get to decide that," she snapped, pushing the cup aside. Paul's expression didn't change. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You don't get to decide much either, do you?" The words hit her like a slap. "You don't know me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the anger burned in her chest. "I don't need to," he replied. His voice was cold now, the kind of cold that made her blood run thick and slow. "I know what happens when you let the past swallow you whole. I've seen it. I've lived it." The words cut deep, too deep. She wanted to fight, to tear into him, to throw something, anything. But all she could do was sit there, her fists clenched at her sides, staring at the floor. Paul stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked over to the window, standing there with his back to her. "Get out of your head, Sarah," he said, his voice soft now, almost regretful. "The past won't change. Not by sitting here and stewing in it. She didn't look up. She couldn't. She wasn't ready to hear it. She wasn't ready to let him tell her what she already knew. Instead, she stood up. Slowly. She needed to move. She needed to leave this room, this cabin, everything that was suffocating her. She grabbed her coat, her hands shaking as she pulled it on. "Where are you going?" Paul asked, his voice cautious. "I don't know," she said. The words left her before she could stop them. She wasn't sure what she was doing. She wasn't sure where she was going. But she couldn't stay here. Not with him. Not with the fire and the silence. She pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cold air hitting her like a slap in the face. The wind bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She needed to feel something other than the heaviness that was inside her. The snow stretched out in front of her, empty and white. The silence surrounded her, pressing in from all sides. She started walking, her boots crunching through the snow, each step leaving a mark behind her. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. She just needed to move. Paul stood in the doorway, watching her go. His face was unreadable, his eyes narrowing in the distance. But he didn't follow her. He didn't say anything. He knew she had to do this. He knew she had to find her own way out. But that didn't stop the feeling in his chest, the way it twisted tight, watching her walk away. Something was breaking in her, something deep inside. And he knew, in the pit of his stomach, that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah kept walking. The cold didn't matter. The land didn't matter. The snow swallowed her footprints, erasing them from the earth. She was running. From what, she didn't know yet. But she knew she had to run. The sun was starting to set when Paul found her again. She had wandered further than she should have, beyond the barn and the fenced-in pastures, to a place she had never seen before. The land was quiet, but it felt different, heavier, as though the earth itself was waiting for something. Sarah stood at the edge of the well, her fingers brushing lightly against the stone. She could feel the coldness of it, seeping through her gloves, through her skin, into her bones. The well was old, the stones weathered and cracked. The bucket was missing, the rope frayed and knotted, useless now. It had been abandoned for years, probably decades, but it still stood, silent and forgotten in the middle of the field. She had been staring into it for who knew how long, watching the dark depths below, feeling like something was calling her. The wind had picked up, the trees around the well swaying as if they, too, were waiting. It was unnerving, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away. There was something about the well that pulled her in, something familiar, like it was a part of her own past, something buried deep inside. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A memory? A sign? Or maybe just the answer to a question she hadn't been able to ask. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Paul's voice came from behind her, sharp, like a crack of thunder in the otherwise still air. He was standing just beyond the tree line, his figure half hidden in the shadows, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Sarah didn't turn. She didn't want to look at him. She could feel his presence, though, the way he moved toward her, the way the ground seemed to shift under his boots. She didn't need him to lecture her. She didn't need him to remind her that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't welcome. "I'm fine," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to see it." Paul came up beside her, standing a few paces away, his eyes fixed on the well. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. There was something about the way he stood there, his presence filling the space between them, like he understood something she didn't. "It's just an old well," he said after a moment, his voice low and unhurried. "No use for it now." Sarah felt a chill run through her, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the way he said it, the way his words hung in the air, empty and distant, like they didn't matter. She couldn't explain it, but she felt something stir inside her. Something deep, something buried in her past. It wasn't the well itself. It was what it represented. She stepped closer to the edge, staring down into the darkness. It was so deep, so unfathomable. There were voices down there, she thought. She could hear them, faint whispers. Her father's voice, her mother's. But they weren't saying anything clear. Just murmurs. Broken pieces of things she could almost grasp but never quite reach. "They're down there," she whispered, barely loud enough for Paul to hear. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her. His silence felt like a weight, pressing down on her chest. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, hesitant. It wasn't like him to ask questions, especially not like this. He had a way of talking, of moving through the world, like he didn't need to know anything more than what was in front of him. But now, standing beside her, something was different. Sarah didn't answer right away. She could feel the cold air biting at her skin, but it didn't matter. "My father," she said finally. "I think he came here before." Paul's face tightened, his jaw clenching. He stepped closer, but not too close. He was always like that, always keeping some distance between them, like he was afraid to get too close. As if it would burn him to be near her. "Your father's not here, Sarah," he said, his voice low and firm, the kind of tone he used when he was trying to convince himself of something. "He's gone." The words hit her like a slap. She hadn't realized how much she needed him to say it. Needed him to say that, yes, her father was gone. Yes, he had left her. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat rising again, threatening to choke her. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know he's gone." She turned away from the well, feeling the weight of it on her chest. The wind was stronger now, picking up, swirling around them, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and cold earth. She could feel the bite of it, the way it seemed to reach inside her, clawing at her insides. She wanted to run again. To disappear into the land, into the silence. But she stayed. Paul watched her for a moment before he spoke again. His voice was softer now, but still edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Your father didn't leave you by choice," he said, his words careful, as if he were testing the air. "I don't know what happened between you two. But you need to understand something. It's not just about you. It's not just about him." She didn't respond right away. His words didn't make sense to her, not fully. How could they? Her father had left her. That was all that mattered. He had abandoned her without a second glance, left her to die alone in the snow. But Paul's presence beside her, silent, watching, waiting, made something shift inside her. It wasn't pity she saw in his eyes. It wasn't even concern. It was something else. Something that made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one carrying a burden. She didn't look at him. But she felt his eyes on her, steady, unrelenting. "I'm not ready to go back," she said, her voice small but firm. "I can't." Paul didn't argue. He didn't push her to go back inside, to return to the cabin and face the quiet, the waiting. Instead, he just stood there, his shoulders tense, but his body still. He didn't say anything more. The wind picked up again, the howling of it louder now, filling the silence between them. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, listening to it, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the cold pressing in from all sides. The well was behind her now, its dark mouth an unreadable thing, waiting. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something else. Something that had been there all along. Something she had to face. The letter was hidden deep inside a box of old things, stuffed beneath stacks of tattered blankets and worn-down tools. Sarah found it when she was exploring the cabin the next day, after Paul had gone out to check the fences. He didn't ask where she was going, just nodded and left her to her own devices. He never really asked much of her at all, except to stay out of his way. The cabin was small, but the corners were crowded with things that had no real place: rusted metal pots, an old rifle leaning against the wall, crates filled with forgotten clothes. But it was the box that caught her attention, tucked away behind the stove. The lid was cracked open, as if it had been looked through and never properly closed again. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, unsure why she felt so drawn to it. But the silence around her felt too heavy, and her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment by the well, those whispers she could barely understand. The well. Her father's face. The cold, lonely silence of it all. She had to know more. She opened the box, her fingers trembling. Inside were a few scraps of paper, faded photographs, and some old letters. One of the letters was folded carefully, tucked between a stack of receipts, the edges worn, the paper fragile. It was addressed to no one in particular, just to whom it may concern, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, rough, jagged. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the brittle paper. As she read, the words blurred at first, then sharpened into focus, each one stabbing at her like an arrow. I'll make it right. I swear. I won't leave her. Not like this. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter was dated a year ago. She had to read it again, the words carving deep into her chest as they sank in. Her father's handwriting. Her father's words. The letter was short, just a few lines, but it burned with meaning. The promise he had made to make it right, to fix whatever wrong he had done. But who was he writing to? And why hadn't she ever seen it? Sarah's fingers gripped the paper tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. There were no answers in the letter. No explanation. Just that phrase, I won't leave her. She had read it too many times. Her head swam. Her father's promises, his words, did they mean anything? Why had he left her to die in the snow? Why had he made that promise and broken it so easily? What had driven him to leave her behind like that? A voice broke through her thoughts, low and rough, like gravel scraping against stone. You shouldn't be going through my things. Sarah looked up, startled, as Paul stood in the doorway. His eyes were dark, narrowed. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a warning, maybe, but also something else. Something like regret. She didn't respond immediately, her fingers still clutching the letter. She couldn't even bring herself to put it down. The words kept spinning in her mind. She had to know. She had to understand. I wasn't, she started, her voice hoarse, but the words didn't come out right. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I found this. It's from my father. Paul didn't move. He didn't step closer, but the air between them thickened. She could feel his presence like a weight in the room, pressing down on her. I told you not to go digging around in things that aren't yours, he said, his tone sharp, though he didn't raise his voice. It was that cold, dangerous quiet, the kind of quiet that warned of something darker, something dangerous. I need to know, Sarah said, her voice a little stronger now. Why did he leave me? Why did he make that promise? Why did he leave me to die in the snow? Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. His eyes dropped to the letter in her hands, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and reached out for the letter. Sarah pulled it back, instinctively, but Paul's hand hovered over it, almost as if he were waiting for her to let go. Give it to me, Sarah, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. But there was something in it, something raw, like he didn't want her to have the answers. Like he didn't want her to know. I need to know, she repeated, the words coming out sharper now, desperate. She felt the heat in her chest rising, the tension in the room thickening, suffocating her. I need to understand why he left me. Paul's eyes flickered with something, a flash of something she couldn't read. He exhaled through his nose, his shoulders tense, as if he were holding something back. But he didn't reach for the letter. He didn't touch her. Instead, he sat down in the chair beside the stove, his gaze fixed on the floor. Your father, he began, his voice quieter now, wasn't a good man? Not like you think he was. He made deals, promises. All the wrong ones. But that doesn't mean he wanted to leave you like that. He didn't have a choice. Sarah stared at him, confusion flooding her. What do you mean? He didn't have a choice? What do you know about him? Paul's eyes shifted up to meet hers. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, his voice low and steady, he said, I was there. When he made that promise. When he told me he'd make it right. But there's more to it than that, Sarah. More you don't know. More he wouldn't tell you. And there's a reason you're here now, in this place. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of his words. She wanted to yell at him, to demand more. But the fear, the unease that lingered in his voice, made her hold back. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her throat tight. "I can't tell you," Paul said, his voice almost a whisper now, like the words were choking him. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's not my story to tell." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Sarah's hands trembled, still clutching the letter, the weight of it heavy in her fingers. Her father's words, his promise, were starting to mean something else now. Something darker. Something that made her want to push the letter away and never look at it again. But she couldn't. She needed to understand. She had to know the truth. And if Paul wasn't going to tell her, then she would have to find it herself. Paul didn't say anything else, and neither did she. The room was thick with the unspoken, the silence pressing down on them both. Sarah could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the letter and her father's words hanging between them like a ghost. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stay here. How much longer she could live in this silence, in this unknown. But one thing was clear, there were things buried deep in the past that needed to come to light. And she was going to find them, no matter what it took. Sarah spent the next few days walking the land, trying to make sense of the heaviness pressing down on her. Paul hadn't spoken much after the incident with the letter. The distance between them had stretched, pulling tighter with each passing day. He seemed to retreat further into the silence of the land, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were carrying something he couldn't put down. She didn't know what she was looking for. All she knew was that the house felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. And so, she walked aimlessly through the snow-covered fields, through the wooded areas behind the cabin. She needed to move. To breathe. To clear her head. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks cutting into the sky like jagged teeth. The wind howled through the trees, but there was something else in the air now. Something she couldn't put into words. The land was speaking to her. She could feel it deep inside, like an electric current running beneath the surface, something ancient and unyielding. She had spent her whole life running from the things that haunted her, from the memory of her father's face, his cold abandonment. But the land, it was different. It wasn't something she could escape. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. As she wandered farther from the cabin, her feet crunching in the snow, she saw something that made her stop. Carved into the bark of a tree, deep, deliberate cuts, was a symbol. A crude shape, resembling a hand, fingers spread wide. It looked old, worn, as if it had been there for years. She reached out, her fingertips brushing against the rough surface. The symbol seemed to vibrate beneath her touch, a strange sensation running through her. She yanked her hand back, her pulse quickening. There was something about it that felt wrong. The air around her seemed to thicken, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her breath caught in her throat. The whispering from the well. The voices that had been haunting her dreams. They were here, too. In the trees, in the land itself. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. Paul's voice, low and steady, cut through the tension. "You shouldn't be out here alone." She didn't turn. She didn't want to. His presence was unsettling now, and the distance between them felt like a chasm she couldn't cross. She could hear the crunch of his boots in the snow as he stepped closer, but she didn't acknowledge him. "What's this?" she asked, her voice flat, as she pointed to the symbol on the tree. She didn't know why she asked. Maybe to break the silence. Maybe to force him to explain something, anything. Paul stepped up beside her, his breath visible in the cold air. He stared at the symbol for a long moment before speaking. "It's an old mark," he said quietly. "The people who lived here before me used it." She turned her head toward him, her brow furrowing. "The people before you? Who are they?" Paul didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the ground, then back at the trees, his gaze distant. "They were here long before I came. This land's been passed down through generations. But some things should stay buried. Buried? Sarah repeated, her voice sharp. What do you mean? What's buried? Paul exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. There's a reason this land's so quiet. A reason no one stays here for long. It's not just the weather. It's the land itself. She felt a chill race down her spine. His words were low, almost like a warning, but they only sparked more questions in her mind. What happened? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. What aren't you telling me? Paul didn't look at her. Instead, he took a few steps back, his hand brushing against the tree, his fingers lingering on the carved symbol. You don't need to know, he said, his tone firm. But there was something in his voice now, something that felt like fear, something that made her heart beat faster. I need to know, Sarah said, taking a step forward, her voice steady with determination. I'm not going to run from this, Paul. I can't. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw something dark pass through them. It's not just your past, Sarah, he said, his voice tightening. This place, it changes people. It does things to them. Like what? She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but the question slipped from her mouth before she could stop it. Paul didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the trees, his jaw clenched, as though he were fighting to keep something inside. For the first time since arriving, Sarah realized how alone he was. Not just in this cabin, but in the world. She had thought he was just a man, hard and distant, but now she understood. He was haunted by something. Something that had to do with the land. With the well. With the voices. She took a step back, her gaze falling to the ground, to the snow beneath her boots. The wind kicked up again, swirling around them, biting at her skin, but it was the silence that cut deepest. This land doesn't forget, Sarah, Paul said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. Whatever happened here, whatever people did, it stays with it. And when you come back, it calls for you. Her heart skipped a beat. The words wrapped around her like a vice. The well. The symbol on the tree. The whispers. They weren't just in her head. They were real. What did my father do? She asked, her voice barely audible, a thread of fear woven into the words. Paul's expression darkened. I don't know, he said softly, but there was a weight to it. But I know he wasn't the first to try to make things right. The air around them seemed to thicken, the land pressing in, holding them in place. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, her chest tight with the weight of his words. She didn't understand it all. She didn't even understand most of it. But she knew now that she couldn't leave. She couldn't turn away from this place. Not when it was calling her. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Sarah felt the weight of the land on her shoulders, heavy, suffocating. Paul walked beside her, his hands stuffed deep in his coat pockets, his head down. When they reached the cabin, Paul paused at the door. He turned to her, his face unreadable. You're not safe here, Sarah, he said quietly, his voice strained. She met his gaze, her heart pounding. Then why haven't you sent me away? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, the wind howling in behind him. Sarah stayed where she was for a long moment, staring out at the snow, the mountain looming in the distance, its dark silhouette against the sky. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fix the past. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. And the mountain was waiting for her to face it. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin. The fire in the hearth crackled, the flames dancing wildly, casting long shadows that stretched across the wooden walls. Sarah sat at the table, her hands trembling as they rested on the old letter Paul had tried to keep hidden. It felt like a ghost, pressing its weight against her chest. She had read it over and over, trying to make sense of the words, of the promises her father had made, but nothing made sense. She didn't know what Paul had been trying to protect her from, but she felt it now, the weight of everything that had been buried. The land, the well, the symbols carved into the trees, all of it, had never been just about her. Her father had been part of something far darker than she could ever have imagined. And Paul. Paul knew more than he let on. He had warned her, but still, here she was. She couldn't run from it anymore. She heard the door creak open behind her. Paul stepped inside, his coat heavy with snow, his face drawn tight. He glanced at her, but didn't speak. "You knew," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence like a sharp crack of thunder. She didn't look up at him, didn't need to. She could feel him standing there, his presence thick in the room. Paul hesitated before answering, his voice low, heavy with something unreadable. "I knew your father. He wasn't the man you think he was." "Then tell me who he was." Sarah stood up suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor. "Tell me what you've been hiding." Paul's gaze flickered to the door, as if considering leaving again, but he didn't. He stayed. He didn't even move. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice hoarse, like the words were being forced out of him. "What matters is that it's done. What your father did, what happened between him and me, it's over." "I don't believe you," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "You've been lying to me, holding back pieces. I found the letter. I saw the mark on the tree. I know what you're hiding." Paul stepped forward, his face tightening with frustration. "You don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "The land doesn't forget. The past doesn't let go. Not here." "I don't care about the land," Sarah spat, the words sharp as knives. "I care about the truth." The fire crackled louder now, the only sound in the room besides their breathing. Paul's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then, his voice dropped, barely a whisper. "I couldn't stop him, Sarah. I couldn't stop what he did." "What did he do?" she demanded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Tell me. What did he leave me with?" Paul ran a hand through his hair, his face grim. "Your father didn't just leave you behind. He left you, for the land. For the curse that's been tied to this place. And when he made that promise to make things right, it wasn't just about you. It was about something else. Something darker. Something none of us could escape." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. "You're lying," she said, her voice trembling now. "Tell me what happened. Tell me everything." Paul met her gaze then, his eyes dark with regret, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Your father wasn't the only one who made a deal with the land. He wasn't the first to try to escape it. And he won't be the last." The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. Sarah felt the chill of the air bite at her skin, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the weight of the truth, crushing her from the inside out. She stared at Paul, her mind racing. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you send me away? If you knew what was happening, why let me stay?" Paul's eyes flickered, something dark passing through them. He didn't answer at first, and when he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "I couldn't send you away. I couldn't let you go." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as they rested at his sides. "Because it's not just about your father. It's about the land, Sarah. It always has been." The air in the cabin grew colder, the wind howling louder outside. Sarah could feel the weight of the land pressing against her chest, the ghosts of the past whispering in the shadows. The well. The tree. The whispers that had followed her, clawing at her mind. She turned toward the door, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice cold with finality. "I'm not staying here. Not anymore." Paul's hand shot out, grabbing her arm, pulling her back. "You can't leave," he said urgently, his voice shaking. "You don't understand what you're up against. You're not free. Not yet." "I don't care," Sarah shot back, jerking her arm free from his grip. "I'd rather be alone than stuck here with this curse." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, thick with the weight of everything that had happened. The silence stretched out between them, oppressive, until it was broken by the sound of something scraping against the door. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was out there. She could feel it. The wind had died down, but the air was thick with something else now, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Sarah, don't, Paul's voice cracked as he stepped forward, his face pale. You don't understand. Before he could finish, the door burst open, the chill of the night air flooding into the cabin. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark sky, was a figure. A man, tall and gaunt, his face hidden in the shadows. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the snow outside. Your father wasn't the only one to make a deal, the figure said, his voice raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. And neither was I. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the figure. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just her imagination. She knew this man. She didn't know how, but she did. Who are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped into the light, revealing his face. It was Paul's face, older, more weathered, but unmistakably his. And the look in his eyes was one Sarah recognized. Guilt. I was the one who made the deal, the man said, his voice a hollow echo. And now, it's time to pay the price. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her. The well, the tree, the land itself, it was all connected, all part of the same twisted, unholy bargain. The past wasn't just behind her anymore. It was here. And there was no escaping it. Paul stepped back, his hand trembling as it reached for her. It's too late, Sarah, he said, his voice breaking. The land won't let you go.